Hi, good morning, all. Deb Myhoff with Communitas. This is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Housing Actions Work Group meeting number 6. Really glad you all are here this morning. Thanks to my colleagues for filling in for me last week. Really appreciate that. So I could spend some time with family. So I'm going to get us rolling as we always do. We have a lot to discuss. And this is a 3-hour meeting again. We'll have a break in the middle-ish of the discussion. I know a few of you will pop in and out because you have some other commitments, but that's fine. We'll keep track of that. So glad everyone is here. Celestina, actually, let's start with a round of introductions of staff and project team that are in the room, and then we will get rolling with talking about the agenda. So Celestina, let's start with you, please.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, housing planner here at DLCD, and one of the couple of folks over here leading this work, along with Thea Croman, who is out today.
Great, thank you so much. Ethan.
Hey everyone, good morning. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the manager of the housing division at DLCD.
Thank you. Ingrid.
Good morning, everyone. Ingrid Cordell. I'm admin support for the housing division at DLCD. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you all know this, but if you're having any sort of technical troubles with the Zoom, you can chat with Ingrid and she'll try to help problem solve with you. Casaria, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Casaria Taylor, Senior Rules Coordinator with DLCD.
Thanks. And then we also have Josh.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Joshua Bombard. I'm the Southern Oregon regional representative for the department and also the lead regional rep.
Thanks so much. And Joel, good to see you here.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joel Matson. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Housing Accountability and Production Office Manager.
Great. Thank you so much. And I know your colleague Sean Edging will be here. He's running just a little bit late getting into the call. And then on the consultant team side, Becky, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Becky Hewitt. I'm a project director with Echo Northwest. Back in just a listening and support mode for this meeting. Happy to have Deb back. And so I'll be here just to listen and see if I can be helpful in next steps.
Thanks, Becky. And Madeline and Lorelei.
I'll go first. Hi, everybody. Lorelei Gentleman with Echo Northwest. And Madeline Miller with Echo Northwest.
Great. Thank you. And it looks like folks are still joining us. Hopefully we'll get a full room this morning. Lots of interesting things to discuss as always. So let's see. Celestina, do you have a slide deck with the agenda or meeting objectives you could share? Great. Thank you. So this morning, this morning, we have a meeting where we're going to be starting to talk about the contextualized housing need rules and program elements. We'll sort of review those for those of you who are newer, or maybe your knowledge of that has gone rusty in the last couple of months. We'll give you a recap on that, and then we'll talk about the differences between completing a contextualized housing need under the current rules, and then what that means about potentially completing it through a potential compliance pathway. And then we'll start to discuss the compliance pathway options to best fit the policy objectives and all of the other things we are trying to aim toward with this work. This is sort of a tee up for our next meeting, which will be in a month. We'll dig in deeper into alternatives for the contextualized housing need compliance pathways. But we want to sort of test some options and ideas with you. There was a memo attached to the agenda. So we will have a bit of a presentation, as I just mentioned, a recap of what we mean when we talk about contextualized housing need. And then we'll go into each of the major 3 elements of that for discussion around how a city might comply to help us put together some alternatives. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Celestina, who has a lot of presentation role this morning. But she's going to start with lining us out on the racial equity framework for decision making for our discussion. I think.
Thanks, Deb. Just finding the unmute with the screen share as well. All right, everybody, as Deb mentioned, we've got a decent amount of presentation, but I'll try and keep it pointed so we can also get to discussion. So starting off this morning is reviewing the racial equity framework for decision making, as we do at each meeting. And for the last few meetings, we've been discussing specifically the two elements of historical inequities and benefits and burdens. And we thought it might be a good time to transition focus to a few of the other elements. Again, all of the elements can be invoked at any time and used as lenses to understand the work of Goal 10 housing planning. But we've been trying to highlight just a few of them to help train our focus a little bit narrower and really explore some of these topics. So probably for the next couple of meetings, we'll be looking at these three: data equity and data justice, community engagement and empowerment, and restorative justice. So we'll take a couple minutes here this morning to read through the prompting questions that we have in this framework that was adopted by our Land Conservation and Development Commission. Data equity and data justice. And these prompts, just to orient before I begin, actually are specifically about developing rules and programs, and some of the questions specifically name rules, but we can also just bring that into the concept stage that we're at right now. So, are the data and research you are using for analysis framed with a data equity and data justice focus? If no, where might you obtain this data? And if data equity and data justice resources are not available, what would you suggest as a way to obtain this information? For example, is there qualitative data available? Community engagement and empowerment. What are the methods of engaging communities in the development of this rule? What are the racial and geographic demographics of communities engaged during the development of this rule? Were there any specific issues raised by communities of color about the impact of this rule? What were they? Did this impact or change the development of the rule? If yes, how? And if no, why not? How have DLCD advisory committees engaged with this rule? So, of course, as the work group, you all are engaging with these concepts and rules, but really most of those other questions are pretty relevant to today's discussion about how we identify housing need based on information available and from our local community. And with that, we'll go to this last section to highlight today, which is restorative justice. So does this rule provide restorative justice measures for the communities most burdened? If yes, what are they? And if not, what would you suggest that is within the jurisdiction of the state of Oregon? What are some other best practices or examples of restorative or transformational justice measures that would address the impact of this rule on the most burdened? These examples can be outside the jurisdiction of DLCD, but could provide concept idea sharing with tribal communities, local governments, businesses, and culturally based nonprofit organizations. So those last couple of questions are oriented to acknowledging that the domain of the state of Oregon can be limited, but we don't have to limit our thinking and our idea sharing and our collaboration if there are restorative justice actions or approaches that we think partners could take as well. I've also got a definition of restorative justice, if helpful to review, and it was also included in your meeting packet. And I might actually just put voice to it here as well. Restorative justice works by bringing together impacted people to figure out an appropriate way to deal with the consequences of an infraction and its implications for all interested parties. The goal is to restore a healthy community by ensuring that the offender takes responsibility, that interested parties determine a proper way to make amends, and that the victim's needs are addressed. So for those of you who are on committees last year for the 2024 portion of this rulemaking. You know that we have grappled with this element of the racial equity framework for decision making, and so far found that what is within the jurisdiction of the state of Oregon in terms of local housing planning isn't quite able to achieve the fullest extent of restorative justice. But that being said, we still keep that as a beacon to orient to see what we can do and how close we might be able to get to restorative justice. So as we explore and start to unpack what it means to identify local housing need and how that then plays into the conversations we have already been having about choosing housing actions, I really encourage us all to carry these three elements forward: data equity and data justice, community engagement and empowerment, and restorative justice. With that, Deb, do you want me to continue on?
Yeah, thank you so much for the additional information on that this morning as well. Yes, please carry on, Celestina.
Great. Okay, so we're going to jump right in here to the introduction to the contextualized housing need. As Deb mentioned, this is a different portion of the Goal 10 housing work and the rules that were adopted last year in December. And so for the purposes of bringing the whole work group up to speed, I'm going to do a little bit of review of what's in the current rules. And hopefully that will help orient us to discuss how we might develop compliance pathways in addition to the current rules. So what is the contextualized housing need? I've got some rule number references here if anyone wants to take a look further or after. So this is Rule 75 in Division 8 that talks about and really outlines the contextualized housing need. And really, it's an analysis relating a city's allocated housing need and housing production target. So those Oregon housing needs analysis numbers of housing need to local qualitative and quantitative information. And there are a few aspects about how we do that that are noted in this introduction portion of the rule. So we need to evaluate fair housing choice and identify fair housing issues in the city in order to affirmatively further fair housing. Work interdepartmentally to do this work, not only planning departments or planning staff, but also other related staff like public works and things like that. And have particular focus on communities of color, low-income communities, individuals with disabilities, and tribal communities. So that's sort of the framing of what the contextualized housing need is and how we orient. And then a little bit more nitty-gritty, the output of this analysis is the needed types, characteristics, and locations of housing that a city must then plan for in its 6 or 8 year housing capacity and production cycle, with the goal, again, of mitigating and remedying the identified fair housing issues in furtherance of fair housing choice. So again, to place this part of the work in time, this is actually the precursor to what we've been talking about in terms of selecting actions. So it's the needs identification of what kind of housing do we actually need in this community, and then that next step of selecting actions to try and promote that. There's a note in the rule that you can use recent work to support this analysis, and that's something to keep in mind. And after the analysis is complete, like I just mentioned, the housing capacity analysis, any associated land use efficiency measures, and the housing production strategy are all designed to be responsive to the contextualized housing need. And one more layer nitty-gritty is the directive in the rule about, okay, so we understand what we're trying to accomplish here. What is the actual work of completing the contextualized housing need? What are the sort of sub-analyses? So it includes an affordability analysis, an analysis of past discriminatory actions or practices, an analysis of fair housing choice, and results in the description and identification of the needed housing types, characteristics, and locations. And I want to unpack just for a moment the issue areas that are identified and named in terms of the analysis of fair housing choice in particular. So the analysis of fair housing choice is broken down to draw attention to and direct analysis on a number of housing issue areas that we know to be particularly relevant and important. Those are things like tenure and wealth building opportunities, permanent housing to resolve homelessness, accessible and adaptable housing, for example. So there is a list here, and I think it's helpful to orient to this list as we also as we begin to understand and consider how we can create a compliance pathway that adds some more predictability to this process, and grapple with how, if and how we can accomplish that. So just wanted to highlight that analysis of fair housing choice is composed of a little over a handful of these focus areas that we call issue areas to unpack. So with that orientation, I also just want to take one moment to highlight the policy objectives that we are working with for this work group as we consider taking these rules and adding this layer of compliance pathway. So this is a quick slide on the policy objectives at a high level. There is a little bit more information in the document linked in the materials, but really what it comes down to is promoting inclusive zoning to enable a diversity of housing options, producing and retrofitting homes in high opportunity areas to increase housing choice, especially related to equity-driven needs, streamlining housing development processes, and increasing community capacity and resilience. So I'll repeat this slide a few times this morning, just to really help us bring these lenses forward as we think about different options. And similarly, I'll be repeating this racial equity framework for decision-making slide. Data equity and data justice, community engagement, empowerment, and restorative justice. And so with those lenses, our policy objectives and this racial equity framework for decision-making, we are working to think about that work of the contextualized housing need as it's currently written as a localized analysis that the state then reviews for compliance as a part of the Goal 10 housing work, and consider if and how we can apply a compliance pathway style approach that we're all probably a little bit used to speaking about by now to that work. So to review, the compliance pathway tools that we have available for consideration are safe harbor, rebuttable presumption, minimum standards, and regulatory requirements. So what we'll be asking you all to help us work through today is how might we take some of these compliance pathway tools and apply them to the work of identifying needed housing types, characteristics, and locations in a way where we can preserve the purpose of the contextualized housing need, hopefully, while also adding on that predictability. So with that, I'll stop for clarifying Q&A.
Any questions about contextualized housing need details and or the compliance pathway recap? Okay, I think we're ready to press on then with our first topic on location, Celestina. Thank you.
Okay, so this morning we're going to start with identifying needed housing locations. So as Deb mentioned, we're going to go through each of the 3 elements of housing: types, locations, and characteristics, and really dig into the details because each of them have a slightly different sort of context and orientation and approach that we might consider for creating a compliance pathway. So when we think about locations, we need to start by really orienting to what we mean by locations in this work. So in this Goal 10 housing planning work, we think of locations as specific geographic areas or a series of areas within a city's boundaries or approved expansion areas. And we also know that locations can significantly impact equity, quality of living, and access to opportunity. So that's a little bit of framing as to why we're having the discussion about locations within a local government. And at a high level, locations include community assets, benefits, things that improve quality of life, and harms. So things that diminish quality of life or can have detrimental health impacts. In this rule, the Rule 5 and the definitions, we list out a number of examples of community assets and harms, including referencing some definitions of key destinations that come up in the transportation planning rules. But for the purposes of today, at a little bit more of a conceptual level, we're not quite that deep in the weeds. I just wanted to highlight the concept of assets and harms so that we can think about locational considerations at that level. And so if we think about those community assets and harms individually as different types of things, like schools or freeways as examples, it can be helpful to also have ways to sort of categorize or almost create typologies for locations within a city that might have a different combination of community assets and harms, or a different combination of community. So that I call today sort of aggregate locational concepts. So how do we take a number of pieces of information about a certain part of a city or county and then name it, and then we can work with it in a different way. So some of the locational concepts that we are familiar with under Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Framework are things like racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty or affluence. So that's really bringing race and income together and looking at patterns as they relate to one another in a city. We also have gentrification and displacement typologies. And we have this concept of high opportunity areas that we see in our policy objectives as a focus for one way to consider where and what kind of housing is needed within a local jurisdiction. And I've also added a note here because we've heard this a little bit in the HOG so far, that while we know that we need to think about how to increase housing choice in high opportunity areas, we can also consider what needs might be present at different levels of opportunity. So if we want to think about it as high opportunity, mid-level opportunity, and low-level opportunity, we can think about it that way as well. But we do have that policy objective at least to think about high opportunity areas. And I just added a note here that, this is just sort of where we are at the moment in terms of trying to conceptualize different locational needs that could be applied to any jurisdiction, but there could be others as we continue to be in this collective work together and explore what it means to, pursue restorative justice and community empowerment and data justice. It's possible that down the line we could think of other aggregate locational concepts, but at the moment, these are the leading concepts that we work with in thinking about affirmatively furthering fair housing. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through what tools we have to help us actually understand what this means locally, because I think many of us might be tracking conceptually, but actually thinking about a city and its boundaries and the locations in that city and bringing these concepts down to ground truth on the ground can be pretty challenging. And so one of the needs that we know we have in this process is to support that understanding, which really comes down to maps. It comes down to these concepts getting applied locally. So I'm going to review some of the tools that we either have in different arenas, and I mean we sort of collectively, not DLCD in particular, and some of what DLCD is starting to work on, because I think that understanding that will both give us a deeper handle on this topic and also support our thinking through what a compliance pathway might look like. So One of the tools that we have is the new equity indicators through the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. So our partner agency, Oregon Housing and Community Services, hosts those equity indicators. And one of them, as directed by statute, is an understanding of segregation, and in this case also concentration by race and income. And I've noted here that these equity indicators have been developed looking at both the census tract level information and the entire city level information based on the different applications of the indicator. So I have a few screenshots for us to look at today. We're not going to get into the details, but I think that just seeing the visual and understanding the types of information that are out there might be helpful. So there is a graph of race and income, and at the city level, cities placed about on the graph in terms of high income and low income, and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color concentration in the city. And then the typology is created out of that, depending on which quadrant a city falls in. We have information just specifically looking at a percentage of high income concentrated tracts. So that's at the census tract level. The same thing for low income concentrated tracts. And we have even sort of more typologies, not based specifically on or based only on the quadrants that we looked at the beginning, but typologies like considering college student population, or where we might have a nexus of income and race, and other places where we might not. And that is also at the census tract level. So it's a little peek. I mean, all of this is already publicly posted, the OHCS equity indicators, but just to orient us. And then another equity indicator. Yeah, it's probably good to pause for a clarifying question. Michael?
Thanks. I just want to make sure I understood the difference between the first chart and the subsequent ones, and maybe the word concentration. Is that first chart you shared is at is a higher percentage of the population at the city level? Is that correct? Whereas the other charts are how many tracts within each city meet certain characteristics?
Right. Yes, I believe, and I think it is helpful to understand this at a high level, and also we probably will hold off on some of those really detailed questions maybe for another meeting, only because what we end up creating for the purposes of this work will probably be a little bit of an aggregate. But yes, this first on the left-hand side, this first snapshot is, I believe, comparing at the city level to other cities in the state where there is concentration of race and income, whereas the other ones are at that tract level instead of the whole city.
I'm going to put in thank you for the question. I'm going to put in the chat the link to the equity dashboard that you all can look at another time. And there's additional information in there about methodologies and other details. Garland, do you have a question about the charts or clarifications needed?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking through like, this is all well and good, but we're talking about planning departments, which were originally the agencies that were charged with creating racial segregation using single family zoning. And so I'm wondering, what is our theory of change here for how we unwrap this? Are we asking those same planning departments to be now in charge of unraveling racial segregation? Or are these charts just actually telling us which planning departments have been most successful at their jobs? Okay, wow, you've achieved racial segregation. Good job. Am I supposed to say Salem, Eugene, and Beaverton? And then also the question is, are we asking the Fox to be in charge of the henhouse here by asking the planning departments to be the ones responsible for desegregating Oregon?
I think on some level, Garland, we are designing a program that is directing the city to make change that is different than past action. There are certainly other ways to affect change that are probably not in the scope of this rulemaking. If there's a different actor that you think might be more suited to do the work, I think, or in combination, I think that is certainly welcomed, and like you said, in terms of a theory of change. But this particular work is looking at what local governments can do, including the planning departments in those local governments, and what their obligations are. So this is just the data phase of this work. So it's the contextualized housing need. And in order to understand what you need to understand what's going on. And then there's that HPS step, which is the next step, which we've been talking about, is what action do you take? So I think at a basic level, the answer is yes. What we're talking about here is local governments doing work to identify their need and take action to change it.
I guess I'm asking, is the planning department the right agency to undo the same harm that they may have been responsible for creating? Or do we need like a separation of powers theory where we task some other agency with overseeing the work of desegregation, such as the Attorney General's office or something like that?
I think it's an interesting question. Ethan, I'll let you jump in, but at the moment, the legislation that we're working under here was developed and puts forward the theory of change, at least in part, that the planning department does have a role. Ethan?
Yeah, I would just expand on that and say that the tools that we're working with here under the Goal 10 framework is about the obligations of Goal 10 don't necessarily fall just in the planning department of that jurisdiction. Those are obligations of the entire city. And so oftentimes the planning departments, community development departments are the entities in those jurisdictions that are the actors or the folks who are like implementing that work. And through the housing production strategy, program, like Celestina had mentioned earlier in this meeting, the kind of cross-divisional, cross-departmental work of a housing production strategy is, part of that program. So I think, Carlin, to answer your question, I think oftentimes local governments are saying, housing production strategies, Goal 10, that is an obligation of the planning department. And we're attempting through this program to break those kinds of lines of thought and say, yeah, this obligation is really of the entire city and not just the planning department. So
clarifying questions from Shannon or Alex. I think Celestina has a little bit more to go before we can launch into discussion. I'll just mention that. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thanks. My internet's a little low. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, camera, thanks. I just want to say factual things. I believe that the people working at city planning departments today are not solely responsible for how we got to today, right? That other humans at other times did some work, and we're living in this time, and just an observation that our National Habitat for Humanity Network has made is when humans living today look at maps like this that clearly show patterns of concentration of wealth and concentration of lack of resources, most people care about that and want to think about ways to do things a different way. And we've been living in this land where we weren't talking about these things or showing them visually, knowing that people learn differently. And I just want to sit in this place of gratitude that we're in this moment in the state of Oregon that I think is like actually huge, and maybe a little bit of a game changer. And it doesn't automatically fix all the things. I'm not quite that much of a Pollyanna individual, but it gives us a context to understand the challenges we're with. And one of my favorite little passages on this point comes from the book Cast, which is to say, we did not erect the uneven pillars and joists, but they're ours to contend with now. this is the moment where we get to decide, we have to have the courage to shine a light and see what the harm is like, because if we don't tend to it, the results of that continuing harm is on us. So we're the repair team, right? And this is about shining a light on the uneven pillars and joists, and then we decide what to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate that grounding. Alexandra?
Really appreciate that, Shannon. I love that quote. I had not heard it before. I just kind of want to center us because, we've got cities in the room here and, they're from our planning departments and, we are the implementers of these rules. We're the ones at the end of the day who are going to be doing this work. And so as we're having these conversations, we're participating in the system, we're participating in the reform, and that does not mean that, there are no bad actors. But it does mean that as we're having these conversations, as we have those practitioners on the ground in the room who are doing this work, who are going to be the ones implementing these rules, who are the ones who, care and are, doing this work for their communities and for their cities as a whole. This is our work to implement at the end of the day. And, it's sometimes a little disheartening to sit in these conversations as cities. And, we're the people here now. We can't account 100% for those who've come before us. We can only account for what work we will commit to going forward. And just kind of recentering on us, this is the work that cities are being asked to do. That is the scope of these rules. If we want to have conversations about things outside the scope of these rules, we can, but this is not the space for that.
Thank
If
you.
I could just respond before we move on, because I think this is actually a super important conversation that we're having right now. And I just want to flag that this work might not be easy. And that I did have a colleague at the city of Portland when I was consulting on the West Portland Town Center. We were leaning into exactly this work. How do you do desegregation in an area with a pocket of segregation? And concurrently, he was working on the racial equity framework for the city of Portland, and perhaps not receiving the support he needed internally, personally, as a human working on that within the city of Portland Planning Department, and he wound up committing suicide. And so I just want to raise that as a cautionary tale that this is not easy work. And the reason I'm asking the questions about the planning department is because I don't want anyone else to start getting involved in this work and to find that they've been hung out to dry by their department because their work has brought up something that's uncomfortable or that maybe implicates their own jurisdiction in past crimes. And I'm just calling into question, is it right to think that an individual employee of the planning department who may not even be a senior employee is the one to carry the torch for racial desegregation without support? And I'm wondering, is there other support avenues that we can offer for employees who do find themselves doing this work? Because it might result in them being ostracized within their own employment community.
Thanks for sharing that, Garland. Yeah, Kirsten.
Thanks, you guys. This is, I really appreciate the city's response to this. Garland, with respect, the state's program is it's a state local partnership, as you know. And, folks have summarized it very well. It's not necessarily our fault, but it's our responsibility once we know. And folks have spoken to the power of data and information and being able to grow and change as humans. But that is the role of DLCD, is to stand by all these communities and also the state as a whole. It's the governor's priority. So your caution is, I understand your caution that comes out of a place of care, understandably. And we plan to stay in solidarity with local planners through our regional representatives and the housing team here and our director's office and our commission. So we're all in partnership. And I don't know if Ethan would like anything to add anything there, because he's really our frontline guy. I'm just here with my pom-poms.
I think just the only thing I'll add is this program that we're talking about right here, right now, the contextualized housing need and the housing production strategy actions all of that is geared towards an approach that is identifying the needs in a more in a deeper, more critical thinking manner than what has existed in the past, and then tying the actions, the action selection, the things within local government's control directly to that identification of need, and saying, you've done the work, you've done the hard work, you've done the taxing work of understanding your community's needs. Now, the next step is to respond in kind to what you've identified, what you've uncovered, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And that's really, the mark of the DLCD housing team in reviewing that housing production strategy. That's what we're looking at. Have those connections been made? Have you done the analysis? Have you taken the actions that are responsive to that analysis, right? And so that work is really in response to this frame of trying to remedy or redress those past harms that we're aware of through that analysis. So.
Thank you, Ethan. Ariel, do you have something to contribute? And then I hate to be I'm acknowledging the big feelings in the room. It is hard work. This is really important work. I appreciate you calling this up, Garland. And then also I'm wanting to make sure we are managing our time today. So sorry, I'm not trying to be insensitive, but I'm also sort of trying to balance these two needs. So thank you for your patience and grace to help me do that. But Ariel, do you have some additional thoughts?
Yeah, just really briefly, I appreciate that you're trying to wrap this up. I can't speak to Tony's legacy in life, here at the city and the work that he did, but everyone in this room is a part of an industry that has participated in segregation and concentration over time. It's not just local planners. So I appreciate that we're all able to come forward and try to move through this work together with the tools that we have and continue to have these conversations. But I just want to acknowledge cities might be implementing this, but it's all of our responsibility. And that's why we're all here in this room together. So appreciate that.
Thank you, Ariel. Really appreciate that. Appreciate everyone. So with that, with our full hearts and brains on the task at hand here to try to figure out how to create solutions, I'll invite Celestina to continue.
Thanks, Deb. We get to unpack these ideas a little bit more because this is only one equity indicator, and we won't even be looking at all of the equity indicators today, but I have drawn out a few of them that are particularly locationally oriented as part of this discussion. So the next one is focused on, oops, let's see, there we go. Specifically gentrification and displacement. So segregation and concentration is a little bit more of a static concept. Where are folks now in relation to others? Whereas gentrification and displacement is looking at different trends to consider really the change in communities. And so this is the Oregon Housing and Community Services equity indicator specifically for gentrification and displacement that's built off of Dr. Lisa Bates's and other collaborators' toolkit on gentrification and displacement that puts forward a different set of typologies. I'll probably be using that word a few times today as we think about different ways to conceptualize location. So different typologies specifically related to experience of gentrification and displacement. This is also at the census tract level, this particular tool, and it's applying that method that was developed specifically to census tracts and cities and local governments in Oregon. So this is another one of the equity indicators. This work actually already existed at OHCS and is sort of folded in as one of the equity indicators when that dashboard launched earlier this year. So the different colors there represent different typologies based on a number of different factors to describe where in the gentrification process a city might be, a census tract might be. And with that, there are recommendations on types of actions that a local government could or should take to mitigate risks of displacement. So for example, one of the typologies includes reference to being particularly vulnerable to displacement, or alternatively being sort of in late stage gentrification where the risk window has sort of passed, maybe not entirely, but if a local government has limited resources, that they might focus anti-displacement in one area rather than another in the census tracts with some of those higher risk typologies. So that's another tool that we currently have to consider in terms of our locational work here today for Goal 10 planning work. And we have a little bit more yet. So we also have the Housing Insights tool, which is not one of the equity indicators, but is something that OHCS has made available for the purposes of their affordable housing funding as a finance agency. And this tool is really focused on mapping certain elements. So less about this typological sort of embedded analysis and more just at least offering some basic mapping for applicants of OHCS funding to be able to use in sort of assessing the characteristics of their project and their application. So it also houses the OHI, the Oregon Affordable Housing Inventory information. So you can see existing affordable housing projects that have been funded by OHCS on the map as well. And so just to give you a couple of other snapshots of what some of the mapped information is in addition to the affordable housing projects that you can see little houses for there. Here's an example of seeing a park in a local government to see mapped access to sort of green space. And then this little H over here we'll click on and see that that is hospital. So hospitals are also mapped. So again, starting to hone in on what sort of tools we have available, consider what might be left on the table that we might want to work on developing. So this is, again, less analysis, more basic information, but in a mapped way, which is helpful. And then we have a tool that isn't quite launched, I don't believe yet, but is soon to be launched, which is actually the DLCD Community Explorer tool. So this is looking at largely demographics and demographic distribution in a local government and is designed to support community engagement efforts, to think about how to do community engagement intentionally, equitably, and where in a community engagement might need to be focused. So this tool is interesting because it uses what I'm calling here today intra-jurisdictional hexes. So far we've been looking at city level information and census tract level information. And this tool actually, I believe it's called raster, uses a raster approach to suggest that we have information at even potentially a more local or hyper-local level, which is this hex level. It's imperfect. It's sort of an estimate, but it uses different data points and connects them in a way that we can look within a jurisdiction and make comparisons and see concentrations, again, at a higher resolution than just census tracts. And the reason, well, I wanted to share this for a number of reasons today, but one of them is for that purpose, because we're really interested, as we know, in this programming, the contextualized housing need and housing production strategy work within a local government, looking at distinctions within that geography. And while census tract work can be supportive of that goal, maybe for larger cities or cities and local governments with more census tracts, it's much more challenging for the mid-sized and smaller cities. So this is something that we're interested in. And I really want to show it just to maybe get ahead of concerns that census tract work is the only way we can do this and get hung up on some of those challenges. And then there's one more I just want to mention, which is the Environmental Justice Council mapping tool. So I've got a couple of inquiries out. Actually, we've got one staff member here at DLCD who I believe is sitting on sort of the committee for this mapping tool and looking to get a little bit more information on this. But the Environmental Justice Council is developing a mapping tool specifically considering the environmental justice considerations of local governments and access to or exposure to harms. And I believe that they're considering some access to opportunity. So talking with them will be very interesting. And the reason I wanted to mention that is because some of these, the topics that they're grappling with are similar to the ones that we are grappling with. And working on actively to create a tool where we can map opportunity. So the Environmental Justice Council work isn't explicitly, focused on the concept of high opportunity, but there is some of that embedded. And we know that with our policy objectives and with everything that we just looked at, that the idea of understanding where in the local government there is opportunity, increasing housing choice where there is opportunity, also protecting communities who might be vulnerable to displacement, which may have different levels of opportunity. Just understanding our local government and our locational landscape through that lens is something that we don't have a great tool for. And so there's a close example of this work, but it's at that census tract level in California rather than at that intra-jurisdictional level. And I have an example here. Deb?
Yeah, I was just going to see if Shannon had a question about the tool.
It's just a supportive comment. I had the chance to participate in some of that work with Oregon Department of Energy around the environmental justice mapping. And I was just going to say this reassuring comment that I believe that perhaps our state had the foresight to download some relevant federal data sets when they were still available. And so rest assured, Oregon Department of Energy has been taking a proactive stance.
Great. Thank you, Shannon.
Yes. And with that, I will just note that, Shannon sort of brought us into that question about, well, what data do we have, given a lot of information historically has been provided by Department of Housing and Urban Development at the federal level. So that is one note that not only at the state level, but I know many folks have made strides to capture at least the information that we had at the time that we had it. And that is an ongoing conversation in terms of what the future looks like that we all get to collectively participate in, but and is important to think about in terms of what compliance pathway we can develop, and also probably not let that limit us entirely, because we do know that we have some data and there will be work moving forward to figure out what the best way to continue to source data is in the long term. But just to round out this item right here, I wanted to show you some screenshots of the opportunity mapping tool that exists in California, again, at the census tract level, not at the more refined hex level, but nonetheless, it gives you an idea of what such a tool could offer. So those are varying levels of opportunity. Highest resource is the way that it's termed to lowest resource. They also have layered in here the income and racial concentration and segregation in a particular methodology that they call high poverty and segregated. And then they also have mapped the 9%, 4% LIHTC development. So it's sort of a merge of some of these ideas in the previous maps that we've looked at. That results in being able to look at census tracts that have different characteristics, like a high resource and a low resource, which is what I've illustrated here. So with that, that is sort of the frame for locations, how we might think about them, how we might think about high opportunity, the work that we are currently doing to provide a tool that helps understand opportunity so that we can support local governments in implementing actions and identifying needs related to opportunity. So hopefully that helps support us in pursuing these policy objectives. So for each of the sections today, locations, types, and characteristics, I have done my best to highlight maybe one of the policy objectives to keep most in mind, again, to sort of focus our feedback. And so easily enough, that one for this topic is producing and retrofitting homes in high opportunity areas that increase housing choice related to equity-driven needs. And for racial equity framework for decision making, especially given the conversation that we just had about data and what is available and how we're using that information, I ask us to really think about data equity and data justice as we have the conversation about potential compliance pathways for location. So almost done here. Excited for conversation. I know we are running late, but I think we had an important conversation earlier. So happy to be where we are. But I just want to highlight, and these are just snapshots from your memo. So trying to sort of reinforce the materials that we already put out about taking all of that and thinking about, well, if we were to create a compliance pathway for local government to identify what sorts of locational needs they have, what might we be able to create, considering the aggregate locational concept of high opportunity, and could we apply that to a safe harbor where local government could defer to statewide methodology and mapping to identify needed housing locations that increase housing choice, including thinking about high opportunity areas, or rebuttable presumption approach where local government must defer to the statewide assessment and analysis that's embedded in a tool like that, unless they can demonstrate a different analysis that better meets needs. A minimum standard being that a local government must use a statewide methodology to understand its locational needs, and they may identify additional needs that are not listed, or regulatory requirement, which would be you must identify the locational needs or defer to the locational needs that are presented by the state methodology, and a local government could not identify other needs. So some examples of how those needs could come to be, or ways that compliance pathway could be built, could be an output of just saying that affordable homes that are affirmatively available to households of a diverse set of races should be made available in racially and ethnically concentrated areas of affluence. That is a similar concept, but a little bit different than high opportunity areas, but we could also think about it as high opportunity areas. And there are also a couple examples at the end here that are sort of beyond more of that narrative identification that we need these kinds of housing in these areas, to more specific quantified approach of distributing housing. So that would be, for example, at least 25% of lands that are zoned to allow middle housing are in high opportunity areas. And this is the piece that we want to discuss today. Back to sort of the rebuttable presumption, safe harbor, minimum standard question, and those examples of, what could we really produce here? And what we want to talk about today is, what do you think makes sense given our policy objectives, the data environment, what we're working on trying to develop, and what the contextualized housing need is charged to do? Which of those options could work, and why or why not? Those are the kinds of things that we're grappling with today. So with that, I will turn it over to Deb.
Great. Thank you, Celestina, for lining us out on this. And I'll just direct you all, if you don't already have it up, the memo on page 9 has the examples that and the outline of compliance pathway that Celestina just presented on location. And then also your agenda has a series of prompts and questions. I'm just going to do a little bit of a time organization here. I think let's give ourselves till 15 or 20 past for this discussion. We can pick it up again after the break if there's more than that needed. But let's go ahead and keep moving here. So, as you're thinking about this, thinking about those compliance pathways, is there one or a couple that seem best suited for how a city demonstrates their contextualized housing need on location? What are some of the considerations for reducing local staff? Helping to address maybe lower local staff capacity for analysis and also increase that predictability for everyone as they move through the contextualized housing need in their process every 6 or 8 years. So let's start with those two questions. Do people have thoughts on best path forward for location? Do you have a question? Oh, great. Thank you. Go ahead, Michael.
I wish I had answers. I just wanted to express gratitude for taking this on. I've heard from many stakeholders and legislators in the process that they were worried that this wouldn't have this level of analysis, and this is a really important, and I don't envy the task of actually figuring out how to do it, but I wanted to express support for the quest here.
Thanks, Michael. Karen.
So I really appreciate the overview of all of the information. And I guess what I am concerned about is that there's not necessarily consistent information available, perhaps at the geography that we need. And so I suppose that, in unincorporated Clackamas County, we're unique from other jurisdictions in that data isn't as easily packed together, and it may not be presented in the same way. So I had kind of asked Celestina the question about the fact that, the urban unincorporated areas weren't included in the displacement data. And so I think that making sure that the data is available in a consistent way for all jurisdictions that need to use it will be important as we think about those compliance pathways. So each jurisdiction can be addressing things in a using similar data.
Do you think that has implications for the kind of compliance pathway that may be appropriate for this? Like maybe safe harbor is, well, I don't know if that's better, but better than a minimum standard because maybe there's some different levels of data for different places.
Yeah, I just think the data needs to be available for each of the jurisdictions in order to meet the various pathways, right? Or maybe someone needs to explain better how the variations in data availability might be addressed through the compliance pathways.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Matt, go ahead.
There are probably two things I wanted to highlight. I think one thing is that where there are data poor environments, sometimes actual minimum standards or perhaps like a rebuttable presumption seems like it would be more useful to some local jurisdictions who might have trouble identifying like baseline needs or even the baseline standards for accessible housing. I'd also note that just a little bit more big picture, I think the way that the rules currently treat the AFFH analysis concerns me a little bit because it really should be addressing all protected classes like race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. And it is currently focused on communities of color, low-income communities, individuals with disabilities, and tribal communities. And I'm concerned that it could be misleading the fact that the state regulatory process has kind of a different emphasis on AFFH than the federal process, which has been defined for quite some time. And assessment of fair housing on the federal level would be a potential tool, because every jurisdiction has to do it. And it could be something that a jurisdiction would want to use when trying to establish their contextual housing need. But if that tool, the assessment of fair housing need for HUD, doesn't align very clearly with what is the state's, I think it'll make it harder to use that tool in both places.
Thank you. So a little caution about, right, a local opportunity map that isn't fully inclusive of all the protected classes, and then some other opportunities with the resources and work under HUD Fair Housing Act. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, and I thought that the maps that were shown about segregation and concentrations of poverty, basically, should also have maps that clearly indicate that with respect to people with disability. If we're really, fully implementing an AFFH process in this process.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful, Matt. Julia.
Yeah, thanks. I am also experiencing unstable internet notifications.
Me too.
So something's going on. So I'm going to keep my camera off. But my first question is related to that because I might have missed it during one of those moments where I got cut out of the meeting. But was the OHCS Oregon Housing Insight tool, and specifically the displacement criteria map, referenced as one of the resources? Yes. Okay, cool. Thanks. So two things. So first, also wanted to acknowledge and also raise, I guess, kind of a awareness and maybe a little bit of caution to Karen's point around just the limitations on how to kind of really zero in on the level of detail that we might want across the state. So I know, for example, like when we get into Eastern Oregon, right, like their census tracts are basically the whole city. And so it becomes very hard to really use that then as a guiding point in terms of where to put things, because that's the whole city. That being said, I also would hope though that we can still leverage tools and data where it does exist. Like I don't necessarily think that we should be going to the lowest common denominator here, at least in terms of like a tool and a reference point. And so with that, I do lean a little bit towards this safe harbor because of that, because I don't think a city should be punished for the lack of their census tracts. That's not something they can really control. But if there's a way to still provide a resource to them so that they can maybe have, state approved data, that would be really helpful. And then my comment around the OHCS mapping tool was also just wanting to make sure that any criteria or process that the state does put together references in some way the criteria that OHCS is using to qualify funding for affordable housing. Because if there's like a limited or no Venn diagram overlap, then anything that is done really won't result in affordable housing because of that. Because if you're trying to say you need to put affordable housing here, but there's no state funding available in that area, that's not gonna work. And I know that the ORCA process has its own issues and limitations and critiques and that it's a moving target, but I just think that that's going to be a really important thing to continue to reference, as imperfect as it is, due to the fact that that is literally the gate into state funding for pretty much all state funding for affordable housing. So I just want to lay that out there as well.
Appreciate that, Julia. And then for you and for others, Julia, I just want to sort of recap. It's just mentioned like maybe Safe Harbor is the best sort of flexible option for this uneven data environment that we're working in. Matt suggested maybe minimum standard is better because we know there isn't data or it's not even to all places. So, and there are these things in between, rebuttable presumption. He might also mention that, but I invite you all to weigh in on that and help us sort of think through what some of those trade-offs are. So, Anne, please go ahead. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Julia.
Also, real quick, I also want to clarify on that too. I think to Matt's point, I would maybe agree in terms of a rebuttable presumption or maybe even a minimum standard on the action side related to the lack of data, as opposed to maybe the analysis side. Just again, I don't think we can do a minimum standard for a city who doesn't have the same data, but I think that then that might translate more to giving them this is then because you don't have the data, then this is just kind of our blanket action that we think you should do because of that, just based on what we know in terms of state trends or something like that. That'd be my kind
of these sort of conditions or for something. Yeah, great. Thank you. I really appreciate that. All right, Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that safe harbors are preferred with the rebuttable presumption option. Minimum standards, when I look at the minimum standards that were on the slides from last week's meeting, you know, some of the examples, and we have to be really careful about what those minimum standards, if we're going to have statewide minimum standards, because cities of 25,000 and larger are so different. And it would be really hard to meet some of those minimum standards, or there'd be a lot of backlash in our communities. Now, I mean, I think that there's just too much diversity. We have good data options. Safe Harbor is something that you can work towards, and then you know, if you can't meet one of the safe harbors, you can rebut it. It would just be, it's much easier for cities to have the safe harbor benchmarks and goalposts than to have something be a minimum requirement. And I'll just use this one example that was on slide from last week. Jurisdictions over 25,000. This was a an example minimum requirement. You know, 25% of zoning must be on land in the ORC areas, high opportunity areas, and then there's a minimum, you know, allow a certain height, a certain FAR, a certain number of units per acre, and then mandatory parking ratios of no higher than 0.75 per unit. I mean, in a city that has a bus that runs once an hour, and even if it's on a transit line, I mean, it's going to take a really long time for Albany to have transit service that runs more frequently than once an hour, for example. I mean, and we do have a transit system, but maybe some other cities that are 25,000 in population don't, for example. So I feel like we have to be really, really careful with what we're lumping into the different minimum standards if we're going to go there. And combining a whole bunch of different standards into one is also really challenging, because it would be easy for us to meet, you know, most of these things in this one minimum requirement, but some of the pieces may not. And every community has different needs. You know, our city, we need more accessible housing and housing for elderly people. And, you know, not everybody wants to live in an apartment complex or, you know, a condominium, et cetera. So I'm really scared about minimum standards. And I mean, if the minimum standards are lower, of course, that would be okay. But some of the things that are on the list are just a lot. It'd be a lot. It would be hard for cities to meet those requirements, I think.
Thank you. And Celestina, did you have something to mention with that?
Yeah, thank you, Deb. I really appreciate those specific comments, Anne. And I know that sort of taking each meeting as its own can be tough, especially at the pace that we're moving. But but I just wanted to offer so that in case anyone else is hearing this and maybe wondering where to go with future comments, that last week's meeting and materials were focused on the housing production strategy and acceleration program portion of the Goal 10 work. So that's, like you were mentioning, and these specific actions like zoning this percentage of land in this way. Whereas today's meeting and materials are oriented to just identifying need. What do we need? And then that action selection would come next. So if possible, thinking specifically just about what do we need, those questions would be helpful for today. That being said, that specific feedback was really helpful, Anne. So I might encourage, if folks are still chewing on some of last week's meeting materials and have thoughts about that, if you're able to jot those down in an email and send them over, or ping us in a different way, that could help us have our cake and eat it too. Get some of that feedback on last week's topic, and also have time today for this needs identification portion. But to your point about, minimum standards overall, they may they play out differently in the needs identification than they do for the action selection. And there are certainly different considerations there.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to acknowledge Anne's comment that minimum standard for analysis, because cities of 25,000, for instance, are so different, are just difficult to imagine the path forward there. But as Celestina just mentioned, we are talking today about compliance pathways for that analysis cities need to go through to determine their housing need before they get to action setting. Josh, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to kind of tag on to what Anne was saying. I think she kind of said most of what I was intending to say, but after working both for and with local governments for over a couple of decades now, especially small and medium-sized jurisdictions, I recognize staff capacity issues, but also getting more specific to the minimum compliance standard being something that can be difficult to apply across the state equitably, both to larger jurisdictions. And I think, using the threshold of 25 plus isn't adequate, because we have some very large communities in Oregon that have very different capacity levels than many of the communities at the 25 and 35,000, population threshold. So, unless you can develop a minimum compliance standard that actually has different standards for population, communities of different population thresholds, like we've done in a bunch of other rules. I think the safe harbor or the rebuttable presumption seems to be, I would think, preferred for small and local, small and medium-sized jurisdictions. We've used the safe harbor in many other cases in rules, so it's familiar, but it also provides small jurisdictions, if they don't have a desire to go any further, to have a fallback. But if they do have a desire, both or either politically or within a planning department, to go further, then they can choose to do that. So I think those seem to be the most attractive.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Appreciate that perspective about statewide issues that may crop up. Garland, thoughts on the compliance pathway options for location?
Yeah, I want to say that, these tools look an awful lot like the same tools we were using over 20 years ago when we performed the first MPO scale environmental justice analysis at MTC in 2001. We mapped concentrations of poverty and of non-white races by census tract, and we called these communities of concern. And this was for RTP, or transportation system analyses. So in theory, we were highlighting areas that might say need better transit service. So I want to ask, what's our theory of change here for this analysis, given that our focus is housing policy? Are we highlighting areas of concentration of poverty because we think that interventions need to be focused on these areas in particular? And if so, what sorts of interventions might we envision for targeting there? Or should we instead be mapping concentrations of racial homogeneity areas of low racial diversity or concentrations of high income households so that we could target interventions in these areas to expand opportunities for housing diversity and deconcentration of wealth. The rebuttable presumption could thus be that high concentrations of white population or of higher income households represent concentrations of racial or economic segregation that should be targeted for housing stock diversification through the legalization of additional lower cost housing types. I guess I'm wondering if we should flip the script, given that we should be focusing on deconcentration. Why are we highlighting the areas that maybe don't need the intervention? Shouldn't we be highlighting the opposite, the rest of the map?
I appreciate those comments, Garland. I think it could be helpful to look and click around in some of the maps just to see that they are often illustrating both, like that last one with the neighborhood typology showed high income as correlated with race, also showed low income. So I think maybe some of what you're talking about is actually there, where the mapping has attempted to identify typologies, not only just one end of one spectrum. And I do think that, especially with the policy objective, looking at bringing housing choice into high opportunity areas, if I'm hearing you correctly, that is in alignment with what you're suggesting, and it is our policy objective. So I'm not sure, maybe there was something in my presentation that maybe misled to consider that we are only focusing on maybe the lower opportunity areas and shifting those. But I think the question on the table is broad. What is the response to these needs is actually that HPS work. And then today we're just focusing on what might the needs be. And so the needs might be this in this location and this over here in this other location. And so trying to support local governments in making those determinations is exactly what we're doing here today. So I think your questions are kind of spot on for what we're wondering if y'all have thoughts on. And then I also added a link in the chat that is the Anti-Displacement and Gentrification Toolkit project that was completed specifically for DLCD to answer, or at least begin to answer some of these questions. And the reason I dropped the link there is because part of the project was to do exactly that work, Garland, of identify the neighborhood typology, at least specifically related to displacement and gentrification, and suggest actions that match that typology. And there are maybe 7 different typologies. It's not just we're looking at this one thing. So the idea that we will emerge from this work with a number of ways to think about location and matched actions, I think is sort of the gold star of where we land. I don't know that we have that for every, I don't think we're quite there yet in the process to have that one-to-one, but I think that's where we're aiming.
Ethan, a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the question, maybe it's helpful to think about these conversations in terms of like where we're at in the timeline of like where this conversation sits in the timeline of a local government's work under this program. So right now we were sitting in the very first couple steps of this time of the housing planning timeline, when we're talking about the manner in which, or the information that cities are collecting, pulling together, both quantitatively, qualitatively, spatially, to set them up for the decisions they will make based on that information in terms of the actions they will take to respond to the realities on the ground. And so that kind of like what we do with this information is a conversation that we're having in this work group, but we're really talking about what kinds of information should a city be looking at, should a local government be looking at, how do they set themselves up for that decision-making process that is the next step in this process. So I just want to highlight that we're in that first phase, we're in that first, we can envision the timeline, we're in that first couple steps of this process. And those questions about what we do with it, or in the housing production strategy, housing capacity analysis, that action selection part of that equation. So we're attempting to set ourselves up for that eventual decision-making.
And sorting through how cities do that analysis to set themselves up for all the work. Okay, I have 3 hands up and we're running a little bit late, so I'm going to take these 3 and then I'm going to move us on to characteristics before we get to a break. Matt, please.
Yeah, I'll try to be pretty quick. I like the distinction that people are making between actions and where we are with this part of the project, which is, just identifying the methodology for the contextual housing need. I do think that in this context, it would be important to lean into rebuttable presumptions rather than safe harbors, because if you rely on safe harbors alone, I'm concerned that you're going to see 70 different methodologies for cities greater than 10,000, 70 different methodologies for cities greater than 2,500, because that's about how many cities are of that size in each group. And I think that it would actually provide more guidance to have a sort of a set methodology, but with the option to, if this doesn't work for your city or the data isn't there, to tell us, what is the way that you would do it alternatively that would be about equal to what we're trying to accomplish. But I do think that a rebuttable presumption would maintain consistency and make it so that cities have more of a go-to in terms of what they're going to do for methodology in identifying the housing need.
That's helpful, Matt. Thank you for the additional clarification and thoughts about the usefulness of rebuttable presumption for this analysis step. Brianne.
Thanks. I just kind of 2 thoughts quickly. I think in general, kind of the safe harbor or rebuttable presumption make the most sense. For this, I worry anything going into minimum standards or regulatory requirements, just every city is very unique, and I don't know that I think that would be the right path. And then just a kind of second question or comment, and I think Ethan helped provide clarity, I think, on where we are in the process. So thank you, Ethan, on that. But I guess what I'm really struggling with still is trying to understand how this will intersect with our actual capacity. And I know that's probably the next step, and I get that but when we're actually looking at vacancy and capacity, and I'm thinking about like how this practically is going to play out, our high opportunity areas and when I'm looking at the list, like those are typically going to be built out, high expensive, low vacancy areas. And I guess I'm just really struggling with, okay, we identified this need and they're all they're in really difficult areas to actually put units, if not dang near impossible. And so how then is it going to, in thinking about these high opportunity areas, knowing that may be the case, just how are we going to actually match kind of our vacancy and our buildable lands inventory as a city to fulfill that? And I am struggling to, I guess, understand how we're taking that into consideration. Yeah.
Hear your concerns on that, and just want to clarify, when you were talking about capacity there, you really meant land capacity, not staff capacity.
Yeah. Sorry, I mean like actual like a buildable lands inventory,
Yes.
Vacancies, partially vacant, redevelopable. That's
yeah,
true
understood.
capacity for new housing units.
Yeah, and how those 2 cross over. Thank you, Ariel. Last word on location for today, and then we'll move along.
Yeah, I had just a statement and then also a question. I agree with Brianne's sort of assessment about the safe harbor and rebuttable presumption being maybe more preferable for jurisdictions. I also think part of why I say that is I also think jurisdictions will be able to more meaningfully comply. I think we'll have less compliance if it is a minimum standard, just because it will be harder even for smaller jurisdictions to sort of meet those. I'm also curious, though, if a lower compliance pathway is selected, will less analysis be available from the state? I would advocate for not, because I think it's still important for us to have these tools available to us. I know you all said that there's still some things that are being developed, but if, safe harbor rebuttable presumption is chosen as a compliance pathway for location, I wouldn't want there to be less data available than if it was a minimum standard or higher. And also to that point, some of the equity dashboard things are downloadable, but we can't map on production of units if we don't have access to the data, and not all of that data is downloadable. So I just wanted to also share that. Yeah, that's what I have.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Ariel. Okay, I'm gonna take a facilitator's objective here and have a break now since we're running just a little bit late. Let's do a break and then let's come back and we'll talk about characteristics and type to close out the meeting. But I'm afraid if we go too much longer here, it's going to be hard to get a break in. So let's do that. Let's come back at 10:40, about 9-ish minutes, and we'll carry on from there. Thank you all. All right. Get going here. I'll give folks just a second. If you all could either give me some sort of reaction or turn your camera on for a moment so I can see you're here, that'd be great. Thank you. All right. Great. Thank you all. Okay, let's move on to our final two topics, sort of a similar conversation, but very different topics. Again, focused on the analysis for housing need. Celestina, I think you have a little bit to tee us up on characteristics, and then we'll get on the discussion.
Indeed. Thank you, Deb. As Deb just mentioned, really bringing similar frame of thinking forward about compliance pathways, but with characteristics, we have kind of a totally different landscape to navigate than the locations conversation, heavy on mapping, because characteristics just has its own qualities. So what exactly are we talking about when we mean characteristics? Next slide, if you have a chance, Ethan. Thank you. I've pulled the definition up from our current rules just to review, which is that characteristics means the attributes or features of residential units that describe their physical, structural, functional, ownership and tenure aspects, or any combination thereof. While that is probably accurate, I think it's easier to understand this concept through examples. So also included in the rules are a list of characteristics for consideration. So on the next slide, we can take a peek at those. This is the exact rule language, but I've tried to sort of bold some of the more pivotal pieces of each of the items for readability here. So we have things like accessibility needs, a major need that we've been discussing really in every meeting. Number of bedrooms, zero-step entrances, multi-generational living, construction type, making sure we have diversity of construction type, culturally relevant features, affordability, tenure type. So that's including ownership, rental, and other models like cooperative ownership and limited equity ownership. Climate adaptation and mitigation features of housing, trauma-informed features and design, and even the idea of co-located services with housing. So while characteristics are separate from location and types, we also understand that there is some overlap. When we were talking about locations, for example, and we saw examples of some of the locational conclusions, we had specific types and sometimes characteristics of housing, like affordable housing, going in particular locations. And so this last characteristic starts to get at a little bit of that overlap as well, understanding that co-locating certain types of housing or certain housing with specific services that may be supportive to the folks that housing is trying to serve is a characteristic of that housing as well. So as you can see from this list, characteristics are sort of wide and varying in what we're considering and talking about. And because of that, it has its own challenges and opportunities in developing compliance pathway to support local governments in saying, what of these characteristics or to what degree do we need to develop housing in our jurisdiction? Which of these do we really need? And considerations about where or how much are also important questions. But getting to those answers is not always super clear, and it can be informed by both quantitative and qualitative input. And that's how the contextualized housing need is written in those base rules. But as we think about how to provide a compliance pathway that adds more predictability or structure to coming to some of these conclusions, we had put together a few options in the memo for how to do that. And so I'm just going to come through here and go through each of those options. Again, you'll see the same sort of visual that you saw in the memo to kind of repeat and get more acclimated with those options. There's less intro for the mapping, or there's less intro than the location section, because really a lot of this is pretty uncharted. So we don't have sort of existing maps or things like that to work from. So I'm just going to jump right in to for characteristics. We have presented 3 different options for how we might pursue a compliance pathway. And then for each of those options, again, we have the consideration of what degree of compliance tool might we apply to the option. And so in looking for your feedback, it's really the nexus of both of those things. Which of these options seems most attractive, and at which compliance level? So for the first one, we have this idea of the compliance pathway focusing only on common and significant key needs. And so the premise here is that we would be assuming that common gaps in meeting housing need are universal across the state, and that we could take an approach that says meeting these key needs would be sufficient to satisfy identifying characteristic need on the basis that they are widely needed and known to be important across the map, literally and figuratively. So in that case, for a safe harbor, local government may use the standardized key needed housing characteristics to be assured compliance and identify those key needed housing characteristics as their needed housing in their contextualized housing need. The rebuttable presumption model, again, would say that local governments must use those standardized key needed housing characteristics unless an analysis can demonstrate that alternative characteristics are more needed and better represent the local need. Minimum standard would mean that jurisdictions must use those key needed housing characteristics, and that it's just an option. If they would like to identify additional needed characteristics, they can, but there's a requirement to use the standardized key needed housing characteristics. And then, of course, regulatory requirement is very simple and straightforward. Jurisdictions must use those key needed housing characteristics, and no other need related to characteristic could be added in. It's just sort of universalized approach to identifying what is needed for housing locally in terms of characteristics. So some examples of what that might look like would be if these were the or some of the key needs, and the conclusion of this work then, if you were to proceed, if a local government were to proceed with a compliance pathway, would be finding these needs. So for example, housing with wealth building opportunities for low and moderate income households. So that would be identifying a certain percentage of units, let's say at the 30 to 80% area median income, so that's low and moderate, being focused on housing with wealth building opportunities. So that would be the way to identify that need. Accessible and adaptable housing being oriented to those type A and type B standards could be understood as, for example, a percentage, maybe 10% of the entire housing production target would be needed as type A units. And so under the compliance pathway through this option, whether it's safe harbor and a local government chose to take it, or let's say a minimum standard, if the compliance pathway was pursued, these conclusions would be the same for all of the local governments. With that, let's go to the next option. So this is very similar, but you'll see in caps and italics that this option is to focus in part on common and significant key needs, but not only on common and significant key needs. And so what that means is that really the compliance pathway doesn't entirely cover characteristics. And what that means is that the compliance pathway is only covering those key needs, and there is still a requirement, even in the safe harbor situation, that local government should demonstrate whether there are other characteristic needs. So there is still that requirement for local analysis and conclusions around needs that maybe aren't identified as key needs. Now, you might be wondering at this point, well, what are the key needs? Those aren't defined quite yet either. We're still at that conceptual level, but with the examples, you can see that we have some ideas of what some of those key needs might be, like accessibility, affordability, access to wealth building opportunities. Those are some of the ones that we've heard repeatedly and know to be needed. So those are some of the ones that we're working with to consider what key needs might be. But that finalization of what that list would be is still to be determined. So I wouldn't want us to get totally hung up on what is on that list. If we think that a compliance pathway that relies on this concept of key needs, particularly for characteristics, is the way to go, then we can further refine what exactly should be on that key needs list. So to return back to this option, focusing in part on common and significant key needs, again, there would be the safe harbor through regulatory requirement spectrum of using those key needs locally, the standardized key needs locally, but for every single one of those options, that local requirement of analysis and conclusion remains for investigating other characteristics and potential needs. So on the next slide, Ethan, I've highlighted how the example that we have in the memo actually duplicates the conclusions from that first option. So those are sort of the key needs that the state would offer standardized needs for. But then there would be local analysis that would apply to other characteristics that are needed. Like the examples that we've provided here are access to exterior gathering space for medium and large groups, which could be a culturally responsive housing need, or housing with climate adaptation and mitigation features, including high efficiency systems, specifically for extremely low, very low, and low income households. So those could be needs that would be identified outside of those standardized key needs through that local process that really wouldn't be covered explicitly by the compliance pathway and would still require state review as well. And with that, I will go into the third option. So the third option is that maybe rather than the standardized approach across the whole state with specific key needs, that the state might provide estimates based on regional data that the local government then applies to some of their local context. I think it's easiest to describe this one. We've kind of gone through the safe harbor to regulatory requirement spectrum a couple times now, and so I think it might be easiest to describe this one by looking at the example. So the state could provide regional data on, for example, existing shares of people with disabilities by type and even by income group, and those shares or percentages could then be applied to the housing production target at each of those income levels or in totality if the estimates provided were in totality and not by income group. Then similarly, the state could provide existing and potentially forecasted age distribution by income group, household size distribution by income level, and this would be regional, and the local government would apply these percentages to their housing production target. So really one of the larger distinctions of this option is that they are estimates from regional data rather than sort of a statewide need that's identified. That you could still call them estimates, but the statewide approach maybe is more just has a lesser degree of granularity. Even though the regional level is still at a pretty high level, it does offer that orientation. And the state could also provide reasonable assumptions about the percentage of new units that likely need to be government assisted, for example, data on existing tenure split by income group. So how do we think about ownership, rental, and limited equity and other tenure types by income? How do we plan for those? Well, maybe there are some reasonable logical assumptions about how we should understand tenure by income level that the state can provide, and again, that can be applied to the local housing production target. So maybe going back just for one moment, I know I jumped forward to the example, but going back to each of the 4 compliance pathway options, we would, in a safe harbor context, the jurisdictions may use those regionalized state-provided estimates and apply those to their target to be assured compliance. Rebuttable presumption, they must use them unless they can demonstrate that a different set of estimates or different characteristic need is more accurate and more accurately represents the need. Minimum standard would be that local governments must use those state-provided estimates for characteristics, but may identify additional needs beyond that minimum standard. And regulatory requirement, really zoning in and limiting the characteristic needs to only those things where the state has provided estimates on what the need might be locally. So I think I may have saved us some time or made back some time, Deb, because I think that's all we've got here. Oh, thank you, Ethan. I will review just the frames that we are looking at local identification of needed housing characteristics through. And so again, we have our HOG policy objectives. And just clicking forward once more, Ethan, we can think about any of these policy objectives, but one of the ones worth highlighting is promoting inclusive zoning to enable a diversity of housing options. And so when we're thinking about characteristics, we're thinking about diversifying the housing stock specifically in terms of characteristics, creating housing options that have varying characteristics, varying culturally relevant features, or varying bedroom counts, or varying levels of accessibility, for example. And then in addition to the policy objectives, we have our racial equity framework for decision making. And so as we think about the compliance pathway and how various compliance pathway tools could be used to determine characteristic need, one of the racial equity framework for decision-making elements to consider is community engagement and empowerment. So some of those questions at the top of the meeting were about things like how has community voice been a part of the rule or the program that we're developing, and how is community empowered in that way? And so I offer that highlight for this section, but again, any elements of the racial equity framework are certainly invited and welcomed as we grapple with what kind of compliance pathway might suit to support local governments in the contextualized housing need for identifying needed characteristics.
Great. Thank you so much, Celestina. Any questions for Celestina before we get into the discussion? And just a reminder, the memo characteristics starts on page 5. And then there are some questions in the agenda as well. But questions for Celestina or the team about analysis for characteristics? Okay. Then let's move on to the discussion. Similar to before, we would like to hear about sort of which compliance pathway seems like it might be suited for various characteristics. Celestina presented in the memo and today some options about how that might work out. And again, just a reminder that we know some of the characteristics, but the details of how those would lay out in various compliance pathways, we're seeking some guidance on. And then I want to draw your attention to a couple of other things. The memo with those examples has some issues for consideration. Some of those are sort of the trade-offs that are being thought about. If you have some thoughts about those considerations, especially around sort of quantifying units with various characteristics, it would be great to hear about that. So let's carry on. Thank you, Kathy. Please go ahead.
Okay, One thing we have not talked much about in any of our meetings is the intersection of 0 to 30% income with supported housing. And that is really difficult because of the amount of community opposition that gets generated around that, especially mental health housing. And so I think cities are going to need to be creative, and they're also going to be needing to do some serious planning around where they're going to locate that. And the state has to help them either neutralize the opposition or provide them with the legal support they're going to need to actually get that cited. And I'm very concerned that there has not been any discussion around this to date, and that this is the homeless population. This is the people who are on our streets. And if we don't take this seriously and give cities the tools to create this housing, we're going to have failed to solve the homeless crisis. So for that reason, I think we need to give the cities as much flexibility as possible. And the first two options are probably the best ones. But I'd love to hear some discussion around how we deal with this.
Great. Thank you for bringing that up. Celestina?
Thanks, Deb, and thank you so much, Kathy. Certainly a very important part of the housing planning work. And I'm going to ask Ethan to pull back up one of the slides here, just to revisit part of some of the example and maybe ask you, Kathy, how we could further implement and support local governments in planning for supportive housing. So one of the potential key characteristic needs in both of the first two options, like you mentioned, that might be better suited, include a key need of permanent, this is the last bullet point, permanent supportive housing or housing with supportive, either capital PSH as it's defined, or more generally, housing with supportive services, and that the state might define a percentage of needed units under 30% AMI, and potentially as well 30 to 60. But to your point, Kathy, we know there's a particularly acute need under 30%. So, if we came up with a percentage to fill in there of those units, let's say under 30 and 30 to 60, and that was a key need in this framework, I guess I have two questions for you, Kathy, is, one, does that start to get at what you're bringing up? And then two, if it does, do you have any thoughts on the compliance tool that would best be applied to support the local governments in actioning on that safe harbor, rebuttable presumption, that kind of thing?
I think safe harbor and rebuttable presumptions are the two, because we have to give cities as much flexibility as possible, but we also need to give them the support they're going to need. And it may be legal support, because there is so much NIMBYism when you deal with that need, that cities are going to have a hard time finding a place to site that housing, and to both to find the fiscal resources and also to be able to site it. So I don't think we should be naive in making this requirement, which I think we have to make, but we have to provide the city some support on how they're able to accomplish this. I mean, I've litigated at least 4 cases trying to cite a group home, and it's taken federal litigation to get it cited. And it's one of the governor's priorities, but she doesn't seem to want to direct the attorney general to give support to the places that get funded by the state to provide these services.
Thank you, Kathy. Julia.
Yeah. First, I want to respond to some of what Kathy was bringing up, because I think those were really great points. And would again reiterate, I think with this one in particular, or with a lot of the points Kathy was making, along with just generally the affordability characteristic part of this, just want to again reiterate kind of that intersection of the location piece, and making sure that there's a very clear overlap between access to funding, in terms of where we're kind of prioritizing or I guess encouraging cities to consider, at the very least, zoning at a density that supports projects that will pencil, and then also in terms of location, get funding from the state, since that is a key piece of this. So, and then also similarly, I like her point around that there needs to be some support for cities to essentially, and developers to eventually be able to actually build these projects. And so again, that kind of makes me wonder if there's further down the line, be it either in the HPS or at least in the accountability phase, some moment where minimum requirements kick in, and that being less in terms of a restriction for a city, but instead more of a backstop for a city, to kind of give them the excuse to say to neighbors, this has to happen. The state is making me do it, and using that as the way to kind of push that forward. So that in terms of Kathy's notes, and then just kind of a general comment. I definitely have been struggling with this one in particular in terms of any generalized, I don't know, whatever standards or things like that for cities, because I think that it starts to run the risk of overgeneralizing kind of community needs. So I really like something more towards kind of state provided estimates. Again, reflecting on the last conversation, though, acknowledging that those could be a challenge in certain parts of the state to be hyper accurate. But I think something like that, I think if there's ways to build on past data from a city, to maybe, I think one of the other examples utilize that where you go like a percentage above, your last outcomes, could be a potential path to look at. I think that this one needs to be based more on kind of a community's own data as opposed to like a state assumption around things where possible. And like the safe harbor and rebuttable presumption because of that.
Great, thank you for that and for pointing out, right, this is really the setup for actions a city then needs to take. So there is that little bit of risk there if you set a minimum standard that doesn't meet a local need. Are you just exacerbating issues? But thank you for bringing up some ideas, some solutions for that potentially, and thinking about the different points of the program, maybe have a different option. Gust, appreciate your patience.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize I was off mute. Hopefully you haven't had to listen to my background noise. I just wanted to respond about the points Kathy was making also. I feel like it's fairly real and relevant in the work that we do. And I just actually had to step off for about 45 minutes to join the PSH Zoom with Oregon Housing about a project we have, and how we're looking to make the project better by offering the tenants this services component. We're recognizing that is lacking in the project, and the city of La Grande was very proactive in helping facilitate this project through an Oregon Housing grant to develop modular cottage home cluster development within the city limits that was contradictory to popular opinion in the community. I think, like Kathy had said, but having the funding to do it well and having, I think, proper design has played a big part in it being accepted. And now that it's operational, we can be a kind of a statement point for other communities to see that it does function well. These are 30 to 60 AMI tenants, and now that we're recognizing that we did put the brick and mortar in place in the community, and that worked. That we need to. It's critical that we put the PSH across the top of that now to keep the tenants whole, especially for the veteran tenants that we're serving there. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that it would be great for the cities to be incentivized by these types of projects that have PSH and are functioning well, and kind of the carrot or the stick, and let them see value in working with developers to create these projects, especially if they have PSH attached to them. So I know that's kind of a smattering of things, but I just wanted to state that it does work and can work, and not have negative reaction or response by the communities. So thank you.
Thanks, Gust, and thanks for bringing your local example to light in LeGrand. Appreciate that. Matt.
The one thing I was thinking about, number one, I think for characteristics, I mentioned this in a prior meeting, but for some characteristics, safe harbors. For other characteristics, rebuttable presumptions. So I think things that lend themselves to rebuttable presumptions are things more like accessibility or affordability. And there were a lot of other characteristics in this list that you provided earlier that are, like you said, pretty novel in a lot of ways, and might lend themselves more to like a safe harbor, given it's kind of a more experimental or a new area that we're delving into. The other thing I wanted to say about rebuttable presumptions, though, is that there is a danger that if you create a rebuttable presumption that only sets a minimum, then you might not be meeting the actual contextualized needs of a specific community. So I would encourage that a rebuttable presumption really set a floor with the caveat that it needs to otherwise be commensurate with the actual identified need. In other words, you could say something like no less than 10% be type A accessible units and commensurate with the actual need identified. I meant, there is a variation across counties in Oregon in terms of the percentage of people with disabilities. I think another one of the challenges is really determining whether that differential in the number of people with disabilities in specific counties is that the baseline that drives production, or is that just actually identifying some sort of shortcoming, like a lack of accessible housing? Let's say, let me find a quick county just to kind of give you an example. But for example, like Malheur County has one of Lake County, actually, down in Southern Oregon, has one of the highest percentages of people with disabilities, as do a number of other kind of rural counties like Crook or Grant County. So it'd be interesting to know, how that correlates to the amount of accessible housing in those counties. But then there are other counties that have less that might be kind of surprising, like proportionally Washington County, or Benson County in particular. Is that shortage because there's a lack of accessible housing? And those are questions I would hope that jurisdictions are investigating as part of this process.
Thanks, Matt. So sort of thinking about methods that may set a floor, but also require some more contextual local need analysis is what I'm kind of hearing here.
Yeah, because I think in the end, what ONA calls for is that you're meeting the actual need, or the contextual need identified. So if you merely set a floor and don't also require that, then to go above that floor, you won't actually be meeting needs for certain jurisdictions.
Thank you for pointing that out. Celestina?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Matt, I just wanted to follow up on one item that I think I heard, which was about sort of investigating the data to better understand maybe why certain needs are or are not present, or certain populations or demographics are or are not present. And I know that we've talked about that a little bit, I think most frequently with regard to income, and comparing income demographics and maybe race as well, even within a city as compared to the region, in order to understand patterns of exclusion. So if the city has a lesser proportion of folks of a certain demographic than the region, that there is a potential that there is something about the city's history or the housing that's available or the opportunities that are available that make it less hospitable for folks of that demographic to be there, and that in fact it might be demonstrating even more of a need to open the doors of that community to those folks. And I wanted to see if that if I was hearing you correctly, because I don't know that we've had that discussion, that local compared to regional necessarily for other demographics.
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head. That's exactly right.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Alexandra, go ahead.
These are a little belated, but wanted to really thank Kathy and Julia both for their comments surrounding permanent supportive housing and some of the challenges that our local jurisdictions face, and kind of how we cite those and public pushback on those. I think this conversation has a part in the process, and I also think there's probably a broader conversation that we have to have as a state, and probably has to go to the legislature, about kind of legal protections there, because I think rural is not going to have the same power for cities when it comes to, pushback and citing and things like that, in terms of giving our jurisdictions, protection and actually that kind of oomph in being able to push these things to get cited. So there's a place in this conversation, and also a place where I will call folks to have a broader conversation.
Thanks, Alexandra. I appreciate that. Yeah, let's see how far we can go here, and also acknowledge that there are probably some things outside of the land use program that are required to really secure that. Shannon.
All right, so this is a mildly outside the box suggestion, but possibly in line with past comments. I think that one thing we're all running up against is that we're trying to mandate something that we need goodwill around, shared goodwill. And we know we lack enough of that shared goodwill. So I just like to suggest that we name that, and that some of this stuff might be formally part of the ONA process, and some of it might need to be ancillary to it. And I think I saw Joel here, thinking of the HAPO office, and here's my wonky, slightly outside the box idea. What if we did some sort of best of tour, in person or virtual, for city managers and elected officials, or maybe even neighborhood association leaders, right? To see what does trauma-informed permanently supportive housing. I've seen gorgeous pictures, but I want to go look at it, built by Nia. Selfishly, I want to go. Can we see these attractive, permanently supportive housing options, understand how much they cost, what it took to get it built? I've had the chance to visit it, the very veteran village that Gus is talking about, and we are, as you know, partnering on other homes because it's so cool, right? Let's go see the cool things together, in the spirit of the Eastern Oregon Summit that Housing Oregon put together, some of what HUD has done regionally in the past, thinking of Western Governors Association convening in Central Oregon. There's a model right? We don't have to completely invent this concept, but I think that we have to put some work into generating the community goodwill among key stakeholders, and that we aren't going to. I also just want to say, like, I see the amazing work being done here by DLCD. Like, how amazing is it to have multiple great options that we're looking at and considering and balancing? Like, that is good work. And I guess in my heart of hearts, I think it's not quite going to get us all the way there. So we might need some of these ancillary things too. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you for calling that out. Yeah, there's some other tools in the toolbox that cities may need and may need help with to advance this, and saw some support for that. Thank you all. I heard a sort of strong pull. I'm really glad we had this conversation specifically around permanently supportive housing for the most poor and currently people that don't have secure housing. And I heard sort of a strong sort of suggestion that safe harbor or rebuttable presumption is probably the best place for that, but also be cautious about setting a threshold that's too low and doesn't actually push cities to get to that actual need. And then maybe think about some other tools or ways, maybe it's other parts of the program, maybe it's other tools altogether, to keep supporting cities and really pushing to advance some of the hardest type of housing to get on the ground that we need the most. I am going to shift us into our last topic. We have half hour-ish. We could probably take 35 minutes. Celestina will tee us up again, and then we'll get into the discussion. So I'm just going to hand it over to Celestina to talk about housing type.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you all. Very rich, helpful discussion. So without further ado, we were going to jump right into housing types. So similarly to the last couple of sections, we want to define what it is we're talking about. So what are housing types? You may have noticed that just housing types as that concept is not currently defined in our rule or really in statute either. It is so frequently discussed, I think, in land use work that a lot of the regulatory work here has sort of assumed a definition, but it is on the table to both define housing types and even just the term housing types and even sub-definitions for the different housing types in the 2025 rules this year. One of the reasons that we didn't include definitions for each of the housing types that we are commonly work with last year is because in the absence of a compliance pathway about housing types, like, a housing type mix that names different housing types, we realized that the rules didn't actually use the words single unit detached or multi-unit attached housing. So for sort of best practice reasons, we didn't include definitions where they were not mentioned in the rule. But it is likely something that we will be putting together this year in 2025 and doing our best to draw on also existing definitions, because some of these housing types are defined elsewhere in statute or rule. But the term housing types generally may be a definition that we need to create for the purposes of the rules. But that's a little bit of framing about housing types and what they are. I've noted, which I think most of you all, if not all of us, again, sort of intuitively know at this point in the field that of the housing types that are on the table. Generally, we think of single unit detached housing, middle housing, which has been defined, as plexes. And there are some specifics of duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, but generally plexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters. And then we have multi-unit attached housing. And for the purposes of the thinking about housing type breakdown at a little bit of a higher level, not defining separately plexes and townhomes, for example, but considering all of that as middle housing. Similarly, the way that we've proposed proceeding for multi-unit is to include single room occupancy as a sort of a variation of multi-unit housing. And I'm realizing here that we've got multi-unit attached, but I believe that in some of the housing type safe harbor considerations that we pursued last year, that we actually landed on removing the word attached and understanding multi-unit that could be attached or detached. So forgive me there for that showing up here today. And of course, we do have a requirement for local governments to plan for manufactured dwelling parks as well. Oftentimes that has been sort of in addition to consideration of a housing type mix of these single unit, middle, and multi-unit attached housing, rather than like a piece of the pie separately. So at the moment, the housing type mixes that we've put forward just focus on single unit, middle housing, and multi-unit, understanding nonetheless that manufactured dwelling park needs still needs to be allowed and accommodated in the local government. But if you all have different thoughts on how we should approach that, please let us know. So that's a review on housing types. Now, because this one, this element, let's say, is a little bit more discrete, we have more options, more ways to sort of move the chess pieces around and say, well, what if we counted and categorized this way or counted and categorized that way? So I will try and move through these somewhat quickly to get to discussion, but maybe just keep that in mind, and even keep in mind that there might be variations that we didn't include here today as potential options, and that we're open to whatever you all think would best meet our policy objectives and our racial equity framework direction. So without further ado, the first option that we have is a mix for the entirety of the housing production target, scaling by city size. So in the interest of time, and given that this is the last element of 3 where we've been discussing these compliance tools, I'm actually probably going to skip over the compliance tool section of each of these options and just go straight to the example. In this case, what we're talking about is including a city size differentiator. So you'll see that's one of the variables between these options, is whether or not to differentiate by city size. City size differentiation and sort of minimums for only certain housing types. So the housing types that are noted here are multi-unit and middle housing, with different minimum percentages for the type mix for each between the varying city sizes. So what that means in application is that regardless of the compliance tool selected, that these are minimums, and that the local government, if using the compliance pathway, could plan for more multi-unit attached housing or more middle housing as a percentage of their type mix, but these would be the minimum bars. So in the next option, we might emphasize affordability brackets of housing production targets and potentially de-emphasize city size. This is just an option. And actually think about an entire housing type mix rather than minimums of only some types. So let's take a peek at that example. So here we've got a type mix for each income bracket, and we've got 100% of the housing type mix represented for each bracket, distributed differently. And so this is where we start to get at concepts around what housing types are most likely to be able to support various income brackets, given we know the costs to develop housing generally. And so making some inferences about how we most likely serve varying income brackets. And going to the next option, we again would think about creating a housing type mix that represents 100% of the housing that's needed. But instead of just saying these are the housing type mixes, you know, in a safe harbor situation, you use them if you want. In a minimum standard situation, or really regulatory requirement situation, you use them as is, or rebuttable presumption is you must use them unless you can demonstrate otherwise. In this case, we're taking that exact mix that totals 100%, but actually suggesting that it would be incrementally applied based on where the local government's housing type mix, most recently planned for housing type mix is. So, for example, if the goal type mix is 50% multi-unit, 35% middle housing, and 15% single unit, then if a local government's last housing capacity analysis or housing needs analysis, and really that should actually say contextualized housing need. Sorry about that, everybody. This is sort of the old paradigm, but if in its most recent contextualized housing need, a jurisdiction identified, for example, less than 50% of housing type need being multi-unit, then, and maybe it was 35%, the jurisdiction should plan for 10% more than it planned for previously, or whatever percentage remains to reach 50%. So the local government previously planned for 35% multi-unit. Then in this next cycle, they should plan for 45% multi-unit at least. And then the following cycle, all that would be left was that 5%. So they should plan for 50% multi-unit. And those cycles that I'm talking about are those 6 or 8 year cycles. So again, the basis is we have identified where we're headed, and instead of going straight there, we might go incrementally. Next option is allowable types for each affordability bracket. And so this is maybe I could characterize it as having a little bit more flexibility in that those exact percentages are really left up to the local government, no matter what level of compliance tool is used, but which types can serve different affordability brackets are limited. So if we look at the example, and you'll see that the affordability brackets may get collapsed in a way when we look at it this way, because the housing type options are only 3 at the moment. We see that for meeting affordability for extremely low income, very low income, and low income households, and the total amount of need that we have there, local governments can only plan to meet that with a mix of multi-unit and middle housing, but that mix is up to the local government. And then for moderate and higher income households, local governments could use multi-unit, middle, and single unit housing, again, at the percentages, combinations of the discretion of the local government. So with that, I will review our policy objectives and racial equity framework frame one more time to help us dig into these options. So our 4 policy objectives overall, with a focus of promoting inclusive zoning to enable a diversity of housing options. So the same one that we touched on for characteristics, thinking about increasing housing choice and diversifying the housing stock as one of the our main policy objectives here that we might further and that we should further with however we take this compliance pathway for housing types. And then additionally, our racial equity framework for decision making. I thought for this last section, we might think about restorative justice a little bit more. So seeing to what extent we may be able to reach for or get closer toward restorative justice as it relates to housing choice, affirmatively furthering fair housing, and the way that our local governments have promoted various housing types, and looking to change that in some ways in the future. That is our queue up. And I just want to say one more thing, just emphasize that I said at the top, which is there are a few different variables across those options that we presented. Variables like differentiating by city size, differentiating by income. And we presented some options, but some of those things could be mixed and matched. There are places where you could add a layer of, also differentiating by city size or also differentiating by income across some of those options. So to not present with 10 different options, we tried to characterize maybe about 4, but we are interested in the breadth of your feedback if you think they could be refined with some of those other factors.
Thank you, Celestina. All right, opening up the discussion. We have maybe around 20 minutes. It's probably about the max we have. Anne, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I like, having recently done a housing needs analysis, the allowable types for each affordability bracket makes the most sense. We've already talked about how cities are so different. So the first option of housing type mix A, with cities over 25,000 having a specific amount of, attached or multi-unit housing. It just doesn't work, and it doesn't necessarily respond to the characteristics and types of needs that each city may have, and the different demographics and what those communities, different ethnicities might desire in housing. So I really don't like housing type mix A at all, because it's just too prescriptive. But I think what makes the most sense, which would actually result in addressing your local needs, is the allowable types of housing for each affordability bracket. And that's exactly what our housing needs analysis laid out. And it might be a little bit similar to the whole housing type mix B, where you're, looking at the different income brackets. And that's what we did. We looked at the income brackets, the kinds of housing units that might be affordable for either ownership or rent. So those are my thoughts. And minimum standards are very scary, especially if you're talking about city sizes and applying minimum standards for the city size. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And I think Celestina mentioned this, but for everyone, cities know this even more. This assumption, like location, feeds into the housing production strategy, action selection, as well as housing capacity analyses, land, buildable land inventory, all of those. So it needs to do that double duty.
And just one other thing. We're planning ahead for transportation facilities, city utilities, and all that. And so to all of a sudden maybe have to have half of our land zoned a certain way. We're doing stuff with climate-friendly areas, already trying to, concentrate higher density and more housing choices in certain areas of town. But it's really hard for other departments to just all of a sudden respond to changes with, city utilities and facilities. So I'm mostly concerned about the housing type mix A and the implications, citywide for those.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Michael, please.
Quickly on Anne's, it seems to me that shifting to a more flexible zoning regime is going in as a state, to the extent that that happens. The first item that you talked about in this goals for this segment is going to require figuring out how to reduce the assumed probability that anything that is zoned for actually gets built, right? If you have broad, relatively flexible zoning over large amounts of area, then very few of those lots are going to develop to their maximum at any given time. And that's just going to be something that we're going to have to figure out gradually as a state, I would hope. I also want to maybe stick up for a point we've heard from Anne a bunch of times in this, which is the small unit or the small lot detached home. So that somewhat questions the type decision and definition that you raised, Celestina, here, that like drawing a hard line between attached townhomes and detached homes that happen to be on comparably small lots. I'm not sure that's a useful distinction, and I wonder if there's a better way to define type that recognizes the fact. I know in my own neighborhood, the cheapest homes that have been built in the last few years are a bunch of detached homes in a cottage cluster, and they're just more land efficient than any of the townhomes that have been built in the last few years. I think there ought to be some way to recognize the fact that What we're really talking about is space efficiency, land efficiency, size of the home. There's a grand tradition of starter homes for, I know Julia's worked in across many ethnicities, trying to connect people with that they have a connection to. And I think that's what we're looking for with middle housing in general. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Celestina?
Yeah, just really quickly, thanks, Deb. Thank you for the comment, Michael. And, something just to continue to spark feedback is that one of the things we talked about in the Needs in Production Technical Advisory Committee last year when we started to unpack these questions was, what if the type mix disaggregated those middle housing types separately? And that was explored, or what is the appropriate grouping, even thinking about multi-unit housing above 20 units versus multi-unit housing below 20 units, because there's a big difference there between a 200-unit multi-unit and a 20-unit. And so definitely open to hearing continued thoughts about how we make these breaks, while still remembering that there's also an application for zoning these zoning parts of the city to support these whatever we identify as the need, and that paradigm is frequently simplified to a large degree to these higher level really density assumptions. So a lot to grapple with there and pull apart, but just wanted to echo the question about how do we cut up the types is a fair question.
Yeah, and then what that means on the implementation side. And I see some cities with hands up, and hopefully they'll help us with that a little bit as well. Brianne.
Thanks. I would just second what Anne said. I tend to lean towards the allowable types for each affordability bracket. That allows cities just more flexibility, kind of giving cities a flexibility for their local jurisdiction to kind of tailor to the local market as well. And every city is going to be totally different, even for what's affordable. And one city may not make as much sense in another city, even by type. And then I have given a lot of thought to the housing types. We went through kind of a draft housing capacity analysis 2 years ago, so happy to even talk offline about that too and not waste too much time here. But yeah, I would kind of second what Michael said of really thinking about, there's a lot of unit types that didn't exist a few years ago. There's new unit types that may not exist in a few years too, to think about that and how do we actually categorize them. When we did our kind of draft work, we looked at kind of traditional single unit detached that you think of as that traditional, and then lumping even like what we call small unit detached. And every cities have different types. That's the other thing to think about too. And these don't match the building code type. So that's also something to think about, but providing some flexibility there. And potentially even flexibilities for cities to define. And then 2 other thoughts. One is, and this is maybe a question, but we can talk about it later, and maybe it's already been addressed, but about ADUs. How are those accounted for in this grand scheme of unit types? I don't know if we need to answer that today, but just pointing that out, I didn't see that in the unit types. And now I don't remember what the last thing I was going to say. I'll send it in comments if I need to.
Okay, great. Thank you. Matt, please go ahead.
But I think one thing to consider when thinking about percentage of different types, I think we really need to map the characteristics that we were previously talking about to the types of housing that actually create those, that actually tie to those characteristics. At least for certain types. For example, accessibility is really tied to buildings that have 4 or more units. And so if we're going to achieve a certain threshold of that characteristic, then the percentage of types of buildings that we require that are 4 or more are going to need to be higher. For example, I do have some, the other thing I would mention is that I guess I'm curious about the incremental approach is how I would put it, because currently over 60% probably closer to 70%. Well, we know that 60% of all the dwellings in Oregon are detached single-family homes. And, you know, I think to a degree we need to consider whether these percentages that we define for multi-unit housing are going to be achievable given that disparity. But on the flip side, you know, you could say that this is how far off we are from the types of housing that we need, that we actually need to drive this harder in the other direction with higher percentages. So I don't have a clear answer for that one, but I think those are two ways to think about the problem. And and then with affordability and tying that to specific housing types, I worry that we're going to create sort of social norms about what types of housing low-income individuals should be living in. So if you define, you know, that they have to all be multi-unit from 0 to 30, are we closing the door to innovative approaches that people take to try to make home ownership more available to people who are lower income? Because that's a great way to create intergenerational wealth, is through actual home ownership. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Matt. I think those last two comments around affordability to housing type and also sort of, you know, existing stock, and does that mean you go harder at multi-unit in the future or acknowledge that in some other way? Those are really things that, yeah, we've all been grappling with and trying to find that balance or the right spot to help guide cities on that. So really appreciate you articulating that. Julia, go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks have said a lot of the things I've been thinking about, so I'll try and keep this brief. But a couple of things I just wanted to lean into. Matt's last point around housing types and income. I have two thoughts on that are in tension with each other. So one being just an acknowledgement. Again, I think I've brought this up many, many times, but the reality of kind of our funding mechanisms for certain types of housing do require a certain amount of density. However, I also really get anxious at, kind of putting a definition on this is the type of housing that poor people live in. And so I don't love that, but I also don't have a perfect way to minimize that tension, besides maybe leaning a little bit more towards a floor for housing types for certain incomes as opposed to a limiter on that. And I kind of want to give a shout out to Gust's projects as an example for this, that again, he's building out, again, as he's mentioned, in Eastern Oregon, housing that is serving folks from anywhere from 0 to 60% AMI, but they're more in kind of like a cottage cluster format. And so I just want to kind of acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that even within the funding tensions, there are opportunities to meet that density requirement by way of a kind of scattered site or split site funding mechanism. It's less common because it's very complicated, but I just want to acknowledge that that exists out there as well. And then just also a thought in terms of kind of the points that Michael was making, is I think it's Wilsonville. It's one of our RAC members had mentioned that they use like an average density zoning concept in parts of their city. And I'm wondering if there's a way to maybe leverage something like that in terms of like density across an area, not density based on like a single lot, to kind of help mitigate some of these thoughts so that it retains some flexibility in meeting the housing types and acknowledging that efficiency of land use that Michael's talking about as being just as good as a single large lot with several smaller homes versus a very small lot with a small home are kind of the same thing.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thanks for elevating some alternative models. Shannon.
I mainly wanted to say yes to what Michael said earlier, and Julia and others have just said. And building on that, I'm thinking of House Bill 2258 that's pending right now. And I want to call out this idea of having predictable siting across communities of differing sizes being something that I see as maybe being in tension with some other direction that DLCD has been given, but really promising for developers, especially this idea of duplexes, triplexes, quads being allowed to be detached as well as attached, and how that can help us with quite a few things, including affordability and accessibility. I also just wanted to remind everyone that, at least to my knowledge, our permitting structure and our permitting costs at the city level have not caught up with middle housing. That middle housing types for homeownership developers, again, to my knowledge, still get treated like single family detached housing, so that we might be paying the same fee for a 900 square foot home that someone's paying for a 4,000 square foot home. And I think that needs work. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. I appreciate that reminder. Ariel, last comment, and then we'll move to wrap up.
Not my intention to be the last commenter every time.
It's all good.
Sorry. Yeah, also here to just sort of echo some of what Matt and Julia were saying. I'm worried about some of the whole housing type mix examples and the potential unintended policy consequences of sort of saying this is, only higher income individuals can have access to this type of housing and choice. And I feel like that conflicts to some extent with some of our other choice decisions. We want to increase choice for individuals who are lower income as well. And I'm not saying the city of Portland would do this, but we have programs that specifically target making affordable single dwelling detached possible. And to say, we shouldn't be focusing on that. That would maybe be for another jurisdiction impetus to remove those types of programs or refocus. And I'm not sure that that's the intended outcome of that. I've also heard, scattered site or group homes, sometimes single dwelling units are the best types for that kind of needed housing. And so that does also tend to be lower income individuals. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I really appreciate sort of thinking that through and reiterating these sort of potential unintended consequences of focusing one type of housing or certain types of housing with certain income brackets. Okay, so we will continue on that. So to that point, let's do a little bit of a wrap up and then talk about what comes next. And just a reminder, or maybe you don't already know this, I just know this, or our team just knows this. Our next meeting is in April. The RAC will meet, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee will meet before we meet again. But at that next meeting, we'll be bringing to you proposals specific to this contextualized housing need compliance pathways. So specific proposals, we did some exploration. We'll take the feedback you gave us today and move into that, bringing you something to pick apart and critique and offer either support or guidance on how to make an alternative better. So that's where we're headed next, but let's talk a little bit about our conversation today and specifically thinking about the racial equity framework for decision making and our discussion. I think, sorry, I don't have it in front of me, Celestina, the main three items, but benefits and burdens, I'm guessing, was one of them. And we definitely had a discussion about that today, sort of, who benefits from certain sort of pathways or options and who might be burdened by that, including that last discussion we just had. And then, our first discussion we had around location and thinking about those areas of concentrated affluence as well as areas of concentrated poverty. and the implications therein. But anyone else have thoughts or comments they'd like to make or reflections on our discussion today? Yeah, Julia.
I just want to give really big kudos to the staff and consultant team. Just having gone through this conversation last year, this was incredibly constructive. Well, and kudos to everyone also in the work group too. This conversation as a whole was very constructive. And I think a lot of that, again, was based on the materials that you all provided to us in terms of examples. And I think it helped us focus and give hopefully feedback that was useful to you. And it felt like a much more productive conversation than we were having last year. So thank you for that. It's good to see the progress moving forward on this.
Thanks, Julia. I agree. It was very constructive, and we heard some sort of new and very specific ideas about some cautions and maybe some pathways forward. So really appreciate that. Any other thoughts or reflections on our discussion? I'd like to acknowledge to just sort of thank you all for the empathy you've brought to this conversation, and for being really forthright and getting through some tough discussions about the real life trade-offs that are happening, not just in our communities that need housing, but also with our partners and staff and all of you that are working to find a way to produce the right kind of housing in the right kind of places to meet the need. And I really appreciate that.
I'll echo that. Thank you, Deb. And I dropped the 3 elements of the racial equity framework for decision making in the chat if helpful to peek at, since we don't have the slides up at the moment. And I heard bits of those elements throughout the conversation. I did hear us think about the data that's available and the limitations of the data that's available, especially for some of these pathways that would be relying more heavily on whatever quantitative data, or could rely more heavily on quantitative data, and grapple with some of those opportunities and challenges, as well as thinking about how we can both provide a compliance pathway and continue to try and value and integrate the local needs that are informed by community engagement as well. I heard your comment, Matt, about can we create a floor while still obligating to plan for local needs if they exceed the floor based on community engagement. And so things like that I heard in the conversation, was happy to hear around trying to retain that while still creating a compliance pathway that I think were really interesting to continue to unpack. And related to community engagement and empowerment is this concept of restorative justice that I don't think we touched on much today, but maybe can be something that we continue to unpack as we get to that next phase, like Deb mentioned, of really refining specific details and alternatives. So just to also echo that that's really where we're heading, is to, on this topic, provide a few alternatives that combine different options that we just discussed into one sort of suite of what if the contextualized housing need compliance pathway worked like this all together, types, characteristics, and locations, and have 3 alternatives to pick apart a little bit more. And then from that conversation, getting to one proposal to say, what if this was the way we did it, with these details even more fully fleshed out, to continue to grapple with some of those specifics and some of those specific consequences and how they carry the racial equity framework principles forward at that more detailed level. So thank you all for both offering feedback at that conceptual level today, and still offering nuggets of details that we can integrate into these alternatives. So I think we're doing a really great job, honestly, of carrying both of those things where we are in time in the conversation. And I look forward to continuing to tease it apart. Ethan, did you have anything you wanted to offer today?
No, I think you, both you and Deb, really touched on the, where we go from here, which is like We have spent some time in that conceptual, like, how could this work? What does it mean? How do the puzzle pieces fit together, and where are we in this timeline? And I'm really looking forward to, having those I'm sure you all are having discussions around those alternatives, proposals, like the true metrics, parameters on how this will actually work. And so I think we have a lot to look forward, and a lot of, yet more interesting, exciting, and difficult conversations to have as a group. So
yeah, and a special thanks to the cities and county for voicing some of the hiccups that may be experienced along the way with different paths, and some of those implementation challenges you all have experienced or can sort of anticipate. That's really important to us. So with that, our next meeting is April 16th. So we're going to have a little bit of a stretch here, where we won't see you. That doesn't mean you're fully welcome to reach out to us in the meantime if you have additional thoughts or ideas or questions, and want to talk about things or send us an email about that, please do. Otherwise, we'll be in touch in early April about our next conversation, which again will be specific proposals around compliance pathways for contextualized housing need. All right, with that, thank you all so much. Happy spring.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.